Hi everyone, my name is Leanne and today I'm going to be bringing you mini reviews of the books that I read in January. So I read 8 books in January. 6 of those were books for younger readers, one of those being a young adult book. So I only read 2 books for adults in January. 4 of the 8 books that I read in January were books that I read for work. So they were children's books published by the publisher that I work for. I'm going to talk about those ones at the end. While they make up 50% of my reading for January in terms of quantity, they definitely didn't take up 50% of my reading time in January because they were all very short. All of them I read in one sitting. So I'm going to save those for the end, and before that I'm going to talk about the other books for younger readers that I read, but I'm going to kick things off by talking about the fiction for adult readers. So I read If I Let You Go by Charlotte Levin. This is a proof copy, but the final book comes out in March. This is the second book that I've read from this author, and I had really high expectations because I loved her previous book. I thought it was so gripping and page-turning. So this is about a woman named Janet Brown who seems to have quite a simple and unfulfilling life for her. She is really heavily restricted by what her husband essentially allows her to do, and those themes of kind of a toxic controlling relationship are prevalent throughout the novel. We also realize that Janet has experienced a terrible loss in her life, and when she finds herself in the modern day involved in a train crash, she is met with the opportunity to do what she wasn't able to do many years previously and save her own life from tremendous grief. News spreads of what she does in the aftermath of this train crash, and she becomes somewhat of a celebrity. Her life is catapulted to tons of new opportunities, vast media attention. But as the story develops, we come to realize that the events surrounding this train crash aren't as clear as we once thought. I did think this was a really great book. Unlike any other kind of story that I've read from before, there were so many aspects of this story that weren't things that I'd read about in fiction before. And I particularly think that topic of being catapulted to media attention in the age of so many new cameras, etc., where things that 20-30 years ago may have never been observed gain huge traction as news stories now. The relationship between Janet and her husband was something that I found really challenging to read about because I think it was depicted so accurately and authentically. It was horrible to read about a woman in this situation. For me, I think it lacked the kind of compulsive reading that I had with this author's previous book, but I would definitely still recommend picking up this one. I also read Pretending by Holly Bourne. Holly Bourne is one of my favourite writers. I will read absolutely everything she writes, from her books for younger readers, for young adults, for adults. I will read everything that she writes. So this is about April, who is a young woman who is struggling with dating. She never really seems to get it past date 5. Every time she thinks that she has met someone and it's going to lead somewhere, it crumbles around her. And she has a huge amount of frustration that I think anyone who has, dated and certainly done like online dating in recent years can definitely relate to. I know I did. And April comes up with this idea of this kind of manic pixie dream girl called Gretel, who is like really, really cool and hot, but also like a little bit aloof and mysterious. She is like the perfect manic pixie dream girl that all the guys are going to fall for. And essentially she starts to pretend to be Gretel. She meets a man named Joshua, and she is seeing huge success in terms of dating as she's pretending to be Gretel. It seems that this relationship is going places because she is pretending to be this fictitious woman. But as things start to progress with Joshua, she realizes that she can't just keep this lie up. She's gonna have to come clean about who she really is. Alongside this, April is also dealing with a really difficult job. She works for this charity where members of the public send in things that they need help with. Many of these things are very difficult subject matters, mental health difficulties, topics of abuse and sexual assault, and it is April's responsibility to respond to these messages, giving guidance. And of course, that is a job that can take tremendous toll on someone's mental health, particularly if they are receiving queries that are really triggering for them because of their own experiences. And a lot of this book has to do with sexual assault. So if that's not something that you feel able to read about, I would avoid this one. And I think it's something that we probably don't talk about enough, is how being a victim of sexual assault can make aspects of dating more difficult and aspects of physical intimacy more difficult. Not always and not for everyone, but it is definitely a thing that happens. So they were the aspects of the book that I thought were really well done. There were other aspects of this book that didn't quite connect with me in the same way. So a lot of the kind of more surface level problems that April has with dating are definitely like conversations that I've had with other friends, and I did find myself kind of rolling my eyes at a lot of the more surface level issues that she's coming across in dating. But I definitely feel like that was a kind of personal bugbear rather than a bugbear with the book. Like, I'm someone who was in the dating game for a very long time, and there were moments where I was like, come on, April, let's get it together. But overall, I thought this was a really great read. It was a book that I found myself really wanting to come back to after I'd put it down. It was a book that when I was reading it on the tube, I didn't want to put it down when I got to my stop, so that's always a good sign. So if you think any of these topics are something that you would like to read about, I would really recommend this one. The one young adult book that I read in January was Radio Silence by Alice Oseman. You know, Alice Oseman, who was the author of the moment when Heartstopper came to Netflix. I read the 4 Heartstopper graphic novels at the tail end of last year, and I had read one of her novels previously. I think it was I Was Born for This, which, what I remember about that book, it was kind of like One Direction fan fiction. In Radio Silence, we are following a teenager named Frances, who is a bit of kind of like a SWAT. Like, she's an absolute study machine. Her like one goal is to get into the university that she wants to get into. She puts a huge amount of pressure on herself for her academic achievements. She doesn't let anything get in the way of this goal. She suppresses all of her secrets. She doesn't really nourish her friendships, and she's even withholding parts of her own identity. That is until she becomes friends with Aled, and around Aled she feels like she can really be herself. The friendship between these two characters grows and grows in that kind of very intense way friendships do when you're that age and you're experiencing a bunch of feelings for the very first time. But the trust between these two friends is broken, and this is partially related to this web show that Frances has been a huge fan of for a really long time, and partially related to the disappearance of Aled's sister, which Frances seems to be involved in some way. I really enjoyed this book, and I thought its depiction of being a teenager felt really authentic. The transition between being a teenager and being, you know, a grown-up. I thought how it dealt with young people coming to understand their sexualities was done in a really sensitive, thoughtful, and nuanced way. And this book was just so compulsively readable as well. Like, I read it so quickly. It's made me really excited to read more books from Alice Oseman. I actually read Loveless in February, so I'm going to be talking about that in my February wrap up. But yes, huge recommendation for kind of Alice Oseman as a whole. Even though I've not read all of Alice Oseman's books yet, I'm very confident that I'm going to really enjoy all of Alice Oseman's books. I also read a middle grade book, and that is Like a Charm by Elle McNichol. I have read 2 books by this author previously and really enjoyed them. While I did like this book, I didn't enjoy it as much as I did her previous books, but you know, that's, you know, to be expected. You're always going to have, when you read multiple books by the same author, there is going to be some that you love more than others. This is about a young girl named Ramya whose family seems to have a lot of secrets. There's a lot of mystery surrounding her grandfather in particular, and things that her grandfather wanted to let her know that maybe her family aren't too keen for her knowing. There seems to be some sort of witchy powers in her family that she's coming to understand, and it takes her on this big adventure where she's learning more about her family and more about herself. And this is particularly related to magical creatures, which I thought was a really cool aspect of this book. I also really loved that this book was set in Edinburgh. I thought that was a really cool setting. It's definitely a place that feels really magical, so it felt really apt for this story. I also really loved this book's engagement with neurodiversity, which is something that if you've read from this author before, you would probably expect. I think she is really telling stories that have been excluded or marginalized in children's fiction for a really long time. I think perhaps the reason I enjoyed this less is because this is the first book in a series. I have the second book in the series on my shelf to read very soon, but I definitely always prefer standalone books to series. So perhaps that's the only reason why I didn't enjoy this one quite as much, because it wasn't kind of a story that was contained within one novel in the same way that her first 2 books were. But if you are looking for some magical middle grade, I think this would still be a great one to pick up, especially if you are someone that likes reading series more than I do. Now onto the books that I read for work. work. So I read Valentine Crow and Mr. Death by Jenny Spangler. So this is a very fun piece of children's fiction that is set in the Victorian era, and it follows Valentine Crow, and he and his best friend Philomena live at a children's home, and they are being sent out of the home to become apprentices. And Valentine Crow, due to an admin error of all things, finds himself being assigned not to Mr. Darth, the watchmaker, but Mr. Death, who is the Grim Reaper. And Valentine Crow is bound to be the apprentice to Mr. Death, helping him with all of his responsibilities around London. However, our protagonist is faced with a very difficult situation when his best friend appears on his list of souls to read. I thought this book was just so much fun. I love how the text interacted with the illustrations and how much fun those illustrations were. I thought all of the characters were really interesting and curious. I love stories where characters who could be seen as, you know, terrifying, like the Grim Reaper, are painted in a more funny, humorous light. It's something that I think is really fun. And how we might think of the Grim Reaper as this like terrifying figure, but he's just like a guy trying to do his job. So yes, really enjoyed this one, and I was expecting to enjoy it, but I think it really took me by surprise with exactly how much I did love it. I also read Villains Academy by Ryan Hammond. This is another piece of highly illustrated middle grade fiction. So this book is set in a school for villains, Villains Academy, and we are following Bram Moon, who is a werewolf. But he is also not this kind of big scary figure that you might expect a villain to be. He's a lot more shy, and he's not really sure that he has it in him to be wicked and villainous. But in a mission to become named Villain of the Week, Bram joins forces with some new friends to embrace his inner badness. This is another one that is just so much fun, really funny for a child reader. And again, really love the role that illustrations play in this book. Bram's group of friends are really fun. There is Brian the Lion, there's Skeletoni, and a whole bunch of fun characters. It kind of gives me like slight Mona the Vampire vibes as well. And finally, I read 2 graphic novels for children, although I only have the first one here, and that is Barb the Brave by Dan Abdo and Jason Patterson. So as I said, I read the first 2 books from this graphic novel series. The third one is coming out later this year, and we are following a warrior named Barb who finds herself in all sorts of chaos and adventure. She has battles to fight, quests to go on, and by her side she also has her Yeti sidekick Porkchop, and there are so many unusual and fun characters throughout these books. I think with these kinds of graphic novel series for young readers, you kind of just need to lean in and embrace the chaos and all of the different strange things that happen and all of the different funny things that happen. What I really love about this graphic novel series is that we have a girl character at the center of them. More often than not with these kinds of series, you either have an animal character or a boy character, and I think it's great to have Barb at the center of this. She kind of reminds me of Merida from Brave, or also like She-Ra. So another recommendation for younger readers in your life. Or if, like me, you just really like reading kids' books. So that is it from me today. I hope you guys enjoyed my mini reviews of the books that I read in January. I will be wrapping up February very soon, so keep your eyes peeled for that. If you have any thoughts on any of the books I've mentioned, do leave me a comment down below, or let me know what you're reading at the minute. If you want to let me know that you're here but you don't have anything in particular to say, leave me some sort of like monster related emoji in honor of Villains Academy. That is it for me today. I hope you guys are doing well, and I will speak to you in my next video.